Hello everyone, welcome to hypertrophy training. I'm going to be taking y'all all the way through the hypertrophy series module, and at the end of this you're going to understand how to analyze your own self or your clients that you're working with, design a program that's going to be hypertrophy based and specific for what they need as competitors or athletes, and be able to truly understand how to personalize this stuff for yourself. So there's lots of ways to program hypertrophy. It's an adaptation that's occurred from training that we can definitely have a lot of ways that we can get there. And so that's what I hope you do take away, that there's lots of good programs out there that meet these tenets for hypertrophy, and we don't need to get stuck in boxes or dogmatic ways that you have to do things this way, because there's lots of different things that work. But we want to make sure that we do understand the main tenets of hypertrophy, and we go around a systematic process to program for people and give them that truly meet their needs. So this first lecture, I'm going to go through the mechanisms of hypertrophy and how those are applied to training. And I think it's important to go through mechanisms to actually know what you're doing in the gym and what that result is. Because I've seen a lot of people train, and you could ask them, why do you do something for, and what are you trying to grow? Like, is it that you're getting a pump and that's causing your muscle to grow? Is it you're getting really tired, or your muscle gets really sore the next day? Like, what are you doing in the gym that's giving you the response that you want? I think it's really, really important to know that at the muscular level. I'm not going to do some huge science dive on you on this, but I do want you to see how it works and understand those points, so when you're building a program, you make sure you're putting emphasis on those variables that really, really do matter. So in this lesson, we're going to go through what is the hypertrophy stimulus, the mechanisms of hypertrophy, how a muscle contracts, types of muscle growth, how the hypertrophy mechanisms relate to training. So we're going to bring this all back out to the practical training, what we see in the gym, and then the variables to manipulate in your training to take advantage of the mechanisms. So I'm going to call back to one of our other lectures on stimulus to fatigue. And this was in our recovery series, so if you need to go back and review that one, please do so. But we talked a lot about fatigue before we've even gotten to the stimulus part, because managing fatigue is huge. We can go train as hard as we want, but if we do a poor job managing fatigue, we might not get as much adaptation to that stimulus as possible. So just a reminder, the overload that we're going for. So when we start a training, go and have some type of training that occurs, that this overload is going to be acute disruption to homeostasis. So this is resistance training. It causes a stress to the body. The adaptation will be the process leading to a functional improvement in performance. So we go in, we train, we have an overload. So this is more weight or more sets or more reps than we've ever done previously. And that stimulus causes an adaptation to occur. With that stimulus, though, is an amount of fatigue that occurs. So if we look at our graph, we have the beginning of a training stimulus at that starting point. There is immediate increase in some type of fitness, but there also is a gigantic amount of fatigue that occurs. And performance will drop off because of that amount of fatigue. But as we reduce fatigue and recover after a workout, that performance will increase, and then we can express that strength that we gained in our next workout. So the recovery point will be returning to your previous performance level. So we talked about fatigue and ways that we can manage fatigue and reduce it and try to get back to that high performance level and train again as fast as possible. But we want to address the stimulus. What is the stimulus that we do need? And you want the right amount of stimulus, right? We don't want to overcook it. We don't want to undercook it. We want to do it just right and have a perfect cake that comes out. So what is the hypertrophy stimulus? So there is an initial stimulus that occurs, and that will lead to molecular signaling, and that will then lead to muscle protein synthesis. And so there's a few main mechanisms that have been alluded to be contributing to this hypertrophy. And some of the main initial stimuluses, and the primary one, take this away. This is the primary one for hypertrophy, is mechanical tension. So we have mechanoreceptors that are found in the muscle that can register tension. They lie in the membranes of these tissues, and they have strands of passive tension that go through them that can register tension and lead to molecular signaling. And they're sensitive to the amount of tension they're exposed to and the duration of tension. There's also metabolic stress. So this is the accumulation of metabolites that you can have during training. While you're training, you have people say lactic acid, which you don't really accumulate lactic acid in the muscle. It dissociates to lactate and hydrogen ion. So there's a raise in acidity in the muscle, which causes fibers to fatigue. There's also other like inorganic phosphates that might be accumulating, and that fatigue accumulation, for one, you'll recruit the threshold motor units, but also that alone, just the metabolic stress, may be a stimulus for hypertrophy. Then the third one is muscle damage. So actual disruption to the muscle fiber structure itself could be a stimulus too. But our main one is mechanical tension, and they all occur kind of simultaneously. So if you see programs like, this is my metabolic stress workout, or this is my tension exercise, you can't really separate these things out, and we don't have an ability to do that within the literature to a certain degree. There's some blood flow restriction that can kind of look at this stuff a little bit separately. But metabolic stress and muscle damage might just be byproducts of mechanical tension. So if you're producing tension in muscle, you're going to be using energy substrate, you're going to have metabolic byproduct that builds up. If you're putting tension on muscle, you're also going to have muscle tissue breakdown. So most of these might just be resultant factors of mechanical tension in the muscle, and not necessarily contributors to a greater hypertrophy stimulus. Now, we can't say this because there is some rationale behind that they might actually be some greater stimulus on their own. So the potentials for metabolic stress and muscle damage. So metabolic stress, we have, for one, an increase in fiber recruitment, increase in myokine production, cell swelling. So just all the lactate hydrogen ions will pull fluids intramuscularly, and just that cell swelling effect could be stimulatory for hypertrophy on its own. So maybe there is something to just the pump in general. We see this a lot even with blood flow restriction training, and that seeing training that causes more metabolic stress has greater rise in growth hormone and testosterone levels. Now, the acute rises in those hormones might not be that contributory to hypertrophy, but the chronic elevations over time could definitely well be so. And concentric muscle contractions are most energetically demanding regarding metabolic stress. So things that have more concentric contractions occurring. Then high repetition training, training that's closer to failure, blood flow restriction, supersets, drop sets. Think of all that stuff that's going to produce a lot of metabolic stress. And very well, it can have an additive effect to hypertrophy, but this is still kind of uncertain. So just keep that in mind when you're reading through programs that having like all these types of like supersets and drop sets, and make sure it's not taking away from your mechanical tension, which is our main driver, just to produce a lot of metabolic stress, which may have just a contribution to it. Muscle damage. So there is a inflammatory process that occurs post-training that is part of the anabolic cascade we need to signal for muscle protein synthesis, and a greater degree of muscle damage does cause a greater degree of inflammatory response. Can increase satellite cell activity, which satellite cells can become part of muscle fiber and cause greater growth responses. It might also be contributing to cell swelling through like this inflammatory response. But too much damage can actually limit hypertrophy, because muscle damage is one of your greatest things for fatigue. So you can remove your central nervous system fatigue, that can recover fairly quickly. Muscle damage can be pretty prolonged. So your muscle damage has a lot of fatigue that can occur along with it. So if you're doing very eccentrically demanding lifts, like say like a barbell RDL has a very large eccentric muscle contraction component to it, it can generate a lot of localized fatigue in the muscle. So it does have a lot of stimulus, but also has a lot of fatigue. And like I said, but the muscle damage component mentioned previously, this might just be a side effect of tension. And muscle damage, honestly, I think if you didn't damage your fibers and you could just keep making stimulus, you'd actually be able to make more stimulus at a more frequent rate and probably grow more. So muscle damage is never what we're after. Muscle soreness is never what we're after. These are more so just side effects from applying tension, and that's my viewpoint on it. Now, when applying this tension and metabolic stress, there's types of hypertrophy that are going to occur. One being muscle hyperplasia, which would be an increase in the number of muscle cells, which has not been proven in humans. It may happen, but it may be at such a small level that we just can't measure it. The way you'd have to do is probably really just to dissect someone. But the evidence is just so limited that we're not going to talk about muscle hyperplasia. But myofibrillar hypertrophy is our main way to increase size and the amount of contractile elements in a skeletal muscle. So this will be the actual increase in the contractile components of the muscle. Then we also have sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. So these are actually fairly newer discoveries that we do have some differences in growth that do occur. How these apply in training, it really might not matter, because we can't maybe separate them to where this type of training is only sarcoplasmic and this type of training is only myofibrillar. There might be some slight ways that we might emphasize more than one more than the other, but not necessarily. With your sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, this is going to be like everything outside of the contractile components of the cell. So the sarcoplasm, like the fluid around the contractile components, the enzymes, the T-tubules, like all the stuff that contributes to the metabolic function in the cell outside of the actual fibers that make make tissue move. So people have said training that might favor more metabolic stress, that has more reliance on anaerobic metabolism, may generate more sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, while training that has more focus on high tension and loads, think like a power lifter maybe, or even one that stays in the lower rep ranges in general, might have more focus for myofibrillar hypertrophy. Again, very hard to separate these out. But I have some images here that just to give you an idea of what this might look like. So this was the cross section of a muscle. So if I took my bicep and I just cut it in half and I turned it towards you, this is looking at the middle of my bicep, and we have all these little circular muscle fibers that are in there. And myofibrillar hypertrophy will look like an increase in the size of those muscle cells, and you can have an increase in the number of those muscle fibers as well. Sarcoplasmic won't be an increase in the number of fibers, but just an increase in the sarcoplasm. So the fibers within, you don't have any differences, but you have a larger sarcoplasm. Now, this is separated out. Both these things are occurring simultaneously. So you have an increase in contractile fiber number and also an increase in sarcoplasm too. Oh, so let's look at inside of a muscle, right? So this is some real physiology, nerdy stuff now. So how does muscle produce tension and contractile force? Because muscle tension is the most important thing. So how does a muscle actually do it? So you see here the actual muscle connecting bone to bone. So it's going to make a bone to bone move. We look a little closer and we see a muscle bundle, which is going to be a bundle of fascicles. So let's look at a fascicle. So we're getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Finally, we get down to an individual muscle cell fiber. And within that muscle cell, will be the actual contractile components of this fiber. And what I want you to look at here is that window that shows the actin and myosin contractile components, and you're going to see how a muscle actually moves and shortens. So if this is our muscle, and it gets shorter and it gets longer, just like our bicep, right? We get shorter, it gets longer. Well, how does it do that? So it has actin and myosin components, which is the sliding filament theory. These bind together and pull the sarcomere closer together, which the sarcomere will be between the Z lines. Don't really need to know that, but what you do need to just see is that actin and myosin, those filaments will bind together and they kind of ratchet along each other and pull closer. So if you think of actin and myosin being kind of like this interwoven fiber, they bind together and then they pull each other and move closer together, and then to lengthen, they ratchet apart and separate, and that's how a muscle moves together and apart. So you have, I don't want to go too far into it, but basically there's a neural signal that goes, there's a release of calcium, and the calcium binds in the tropomyosin complex, and it allows myosin to bind to actin, and it will then be able to move along and shorten the muscle fiber. Now, that neural signal that's sent is sent through a nerve, and that nerve is going to innervate a certain amount of muscle fibers, muscle cells. And that could be 2 to 3 muscle cells. It might be thousands of muscle cells. Depending on how many muscle cells that it can innervate will determine the size of it. So this is when you see low threshold motor units or high threshold motor units. So the motor unit is going to be the nerve cell and the number of fibers that it innervates. So our highest threshold motor units are going to be recruiting large amounts of muscle fiber. Usually these are your fast twitch muscle fiber, and those are ones needed when you're getting close to muscle failure or at high speeds. The lower motor units are going to be slow twitch muscle fiber, ones that are fairly fatigue resistant, which is going to be important for when we're training and we want to recruit these high threshold motor units. So what determines the level of tension that we do have exposure to in the muscle? So more external resistance does not necessarily mean more internal tension. So the fiber, the tension, this mechanical tension, what matters is at the fiber level. Don't think of tension of what you're holding in your hand. Don't think of more weight means more tension, because that's not always the case. What matters is at the fiber level. And so if you're not getting all fibers recruited, or you're not even using that muscle to lift the weight, you're not going to get tension at that muscle. So think about a bicep curl. When we see someone swinging back and forth, they're using their delts, they're using their lower back, they're using a lot of momentum to move the weight. Yes, they might have a big weight they're holding in their hand, a large external resistance, but they have all this tension being applied to other muscle groups they don't want to. So the actual bicep might not be exposed to a great degree of tension. Now, that same person keeps their elbows locked in, they only move through elbow flexion. They might use a lighter weight because the bicep's the only contributing muscle, but they might be getting a better tension stimulus than that person that's swinging the weight around. So not always is the greater load going to matter, but it also has some other factors that go into it, and we're going to talk about those. So for one, the size principle, which is Henneman's size principle for motor unit recruitment. So a low threshold motor unit is going to get activated at the early beginning of a set. So when you start lifting weight, it's not hard, right? Well, your body's smart. It's going to say, hey, we just need a couple muscle fibers to work right now, all right? Then as you get tired, those early fibers are going to fatigue out, and you're going to need more fibers to contribute. So now you're going to recruit higher threshold motor units that are recruiting your fast twitch muscle fibers and more of them. And so now you're really contracting hard. Then those start getting tired, right? Then you start going really slow through your contractions. And now you're getting a full motor unit recruitment, and you're recruiting all those muscle fibers, and all those muscle fibers are getting tension on them. So what about that slow rate that we're talking about, right? At the end of the set, when you're just like slowly grinding away, why does that matter? Because during slow contraction velocities, you generate a high amount of force. And that's because actin and myosin, moving slowly, have better connection with each other. So more of the myosin heads can connect to actin. I think of it as like, the end of like a soccer game or basketball game. The players walk by each other, and as they're walking by, everyone like high fives. If you walk real slow, you can make sure to like make good contact with someone's hands. If you like sprint by them, you like maybe kind of miss their hand, maybe you miss some, right? You don't have a good connection. So I think of actin and myosin like this. Like if you're moving slow, you can get really good contact and grab onto someone's hand. And if the myosin heads are grabbing onto actin really well, they can make a lot of force. And so that's what needs to happen when you're trying to lift like these maximum weights and your muscles fatiguing. It has to use everything to grab onto actin to really pull it along and shorten. So that is the force velocity curve. So at slow velocities, you produce a lot of force. So think about this. When you're failing, you're moving really, really slow. So that's when you're going to generate a lot of force in the muscle. That's a good thing. Also, if you're lifting a really heavy weight, like say you're like, you can squat 500 pounds and you put 500 on there and you go down, you're like slowly grinding it up, right? You're moving slow velocity, you're going to produce a high amount of force in the muscle. Another thing to this is the length-tension relationship. So the muscles produce more force at certain lengths. More force produced at longer muscle lengths, and at typically shorter muscle lengths, they won't produce as much force. And the most force, usually the muscle produces the best force at a resting length. So if you were just standing here with your bicep just completely relaxed, that's the spot where you could probably produce the most force. At the extreme ends, so if I had my relaxed bicep and I lock out my elbow and I'm going to do a bicep curl, I'd actually be a little bit weaker at that point. Now, there would be some stretch in my bicep, right? You would feel some like tension. That's passive tension. So that's not that active tension that really contributes to a hypertrophy stimulus. However, passive tension does have a little bit more of an additive effect to the total tension that you experience when you contract a muscle. So the most tension stimulus you get is at longer muscle lengths. So that's important for when we're programming. We want to make sure we get to longer muscle lengths. At short muscle lengths, well, if my muscle's already shortened, gosh, I can't really produce a lot of force anymore. So at the other extreme, you won't produce as much tension. This is going to matter when we're picking out exercises and how we want to position our bodies. And part of that will go into the internal moment arms. So we're getting into physics. I don't want to bog y'all down with physics, okay? But say I have that same bicep curl. I'm standing here with a dumbbell. Well, dumbbells doesn't have much tension on the bicep yet, right? Because I'm just standing here. As I raise up my dumbbell, my arm gets far away from me. So this is your moment arm, and that dumbbell will get heavier the farther out it goes. Then as I get closer to the body and that wrist gets closer to the elbow, that moment arm decreases. And I won't be having as much torque at the joint. So depending on where your moment arm is also going to affect the force. So we have the force just from where the muscle's contracting, but then we also have the force depending on how the muscle is positioned in space. So we're going to get into this more when we get into like exercise selection and looking at setup, but these are things I just want you to know about how tension's made in the muscle. Then we talked about this, but fatigue. And it goes back to the size principle, right? So if you're having a lot of fatigue generated in the muscle, fibers are getting tired, you're going to recruit your higher threshold motor units and produce more muscular force. All right, guys, thank you for hanging in there with me. I promise I'm going to get back to training, and now I am. So all that stuff I just said, what does that actually look like in the gym, what we're doing? And this is it. Take this away. To get high levels of mechanical tension, you need to do hard sets. This is my point, my main takeaway, just to get to say that. So a set has to be really challenging and close proximity to muscular failure to recruit high threshold motor units and get high degrees of mechanical tension. All right? Now, what type of loads would we use to do this? Now, a heavy load, so over 85% of your 1 rep max, so that might be 1 to 5 reps. We'll recruit your high threshold motor units, all muscle fibers, right away. The first rep you do, you're gonna recruit all muscle fibers. So it'll be very stimulating reps with a high amount of tension. Also, with lighter loads, you can do this too. 15 plus 1 rep max, or even moderate, 6 to 15 reps. What we've seen in the research is maybe there's about a cutoff around 30 reps or so, which you have to do a lot of reps to get close to failure, right? So it might not be optimal to always train that high, but you could do it in certain instances. That's why a lot of our hypertrophy training you see between like that old like kind of 8 to 12 reps is usually like a kind of a sweet spot where you can get some good tension, but you're also not getting so much fatigue from doing really, really high rep. But between these rep ranges, 15 plus or 6 to 15, you can get high amounts of tension as long as those sets are taking close proximity to muscular failure. Hard sets. So this starts to give the notion, idea of that there are effective reps or stimulating reps, because as you get close to failure, those are the reps that really matter and stimulate because they produce a high amount of mechanical tension. Now with the heavy load, you get stimulating reps right away, right? But how many of these stimulating reps do you need? And there's gonna be a certain amount that you do need, a dosage, if we wanna say it, to cause a lot of growth. And there's also some limitations, right? So what if you needed, say, 20 stimulating reps? Well, you're gonna take your 1 rep max and do it for 20 times? Oh my God, you'd be freaking destroyed, right? Like that's completely impractical. So maybe you have like a set of 5 you do, which are all stimulating, but to get enough volume in, to have enough stimulating reps, you might do some work between the 8 to 12 rep range, maybe some sets of 15 that are close to failure. That way you get enough dosage of stimulating reps. So within this tension, we have a degree and a magnitude of tension that needs to happen, but also some exposure level that you need. So a time duration or a frequency of it that must happen. And what we see in the literature is that there is a dosage of tension that you need for growth. And this looks like an inverse U relatively. We don't have it quite figured out, but it is a U curve. We look at the graph that's present here. At the bottom end of the graph, you see someone doing no sets. And the rate of growth is gonna be none, right? Maybe you're even having atrophy because you're not even training anymore. Then as you start doing a few sets, your growth rate increases. And then you get to some point on this where you have an optimal amount of growth. You're recovering well, you can come back and overload and get another stimulus. And this is the point where this is like your sweet spot. You're like, well, I'm gonna do a few more hard sets, get some more stimulating reps in. At some point, that amount of stimulus won't be any greater, and but it's gonna generate a significant amount more fatigue. So what happens when you have a lot of fatigue? Well, you don't recover, right? You come back and your performance kind of sucks. And now your workouts are getting worse. Your strength is decreasing. So now that same stimulus is no longer overloading. And you start decreasing in muscle growth. You start having atrophy occur. So there is too much, and there can be too little. So there is a sweet spot, and that's what we're looking for. And I say this as a tension stimulus, but this is really gonna be volume. And we're gonna talk about volume just being the number of hard sets that we do. I think that's an easy way for us to talk about it. So the programming variables that we're gonna be looking at when we design our training for tension stimulus. The one thing that we'll look at first will be volume. So that's gonna be the dosage of stimulus, the number of hard sets you're gonna do. The intensity, so that's gonna be the degree of stimulus magnitude. So this might be the percentage of your 1 rep max you train with, or it might be the proximity of failure you're gonna be training with. And then the frequency. So how are we gonna organize the training stimulus? This will be like your training split. Are you training back twice a week? Are you doing push-pull legs or upper lower? The exercise selection is going to matter, and this will be the regional stimulus. So where are we trying to put a stimulus to? And the movement pattern choice and the muscle it involves is going to matter for applying that stimulus. Also, the execution and tempo is going to matter for the focus of that stimulus, the way in which you move during your repetitions and with intention. So are you thinking about the muscle you're training? Are you connecting well with it? Are you moving in a way to optimize the stimulus for that muscle? Then the order. So the sequence of stimulus and the effectiveness. I mentioned earlier in this lecture, as you train in your workout, those reps are going to get less stimulating because of overall systemic fatigue, and you're going to have less motor unit recruitment. So say you put triceps at the end of your workout, your tricep work is going to be less stimulative than those first exercises that you do. So depending on your training need, you might need triceps first, or you might need chest first. Just depends, but that's something to think about stimulus. Then the rest periods that we put in place will be the removal of stimulus and the time between those sets. So in summary, the main driver mechanism of hypertrophy is mechanical tension. Mechanical tension can be created with heavy and light load sets that are taken near or proximity to muscle failure. So this is the important thing. We have to have hard training. That's what I want to emphasize, guys. You can't go in there and just do these pump workouts, stay really far from failure, and just do a whole bunch of sets. It's all about making the most stimulus of your sets possible, using the best form possible. Then from that point on, we'll see how much dosage that we need of that stimulus. But I want to set the standard for quality stimulus off the bat. Metabolic stress and muscle damage may be additive factors to hypertrophy, but also might just be resultant factors of mechanical tension. Programming variables for hypertrophy revolve around how we will apply tension in an organized manner. So next, through all these next lectures, we're going to go through, for one, a needs analysis of what you need as an athlete, then looking at programming volume, intensity, and frequency, what that training split that you need, and then looking at picking your exercises, the order of those exercises, rest times, and laying it all out, then how we're gonna use progressive overload throughout the weeks, and then also we're gonna get into managing deloads and having flexibility within our plan, and getting into like the what ifs. What do you do if your strength drops off or you're not recovering? How do you adjust volume? How do you know if you're doing enough? Should I do rest pause sets? We're going to get into all that. So these are the lectures to come, guys. Hope you enjoyed this one.